Before I go to the presentation, I would like to define where I'm going to deal with these different definitions which we are today discussing. So, are all people on the move migrants? Well, in population studies, as we love numbers, we need to define it quite precisely. And usually, it means that you have to have some rules. And it concerns always that despite migration is, in general, relocation oneself in time and space, we have to consider for how long. Is any move considered as a migration, not in population studies? We should consider more than 1 year of stays in a host society as a migration. And that excludes a lot of different kind of moves around the world. But also among these categories, we can also define separately permanent and temporary, as some countries do, like US or Canada or Australia, depending already on their regulations. Another thing we need to distinguish is how far. And in regular migration, which we are concerned about, we usually think of those migrations which take place over administrative borders. Here we come again to a problem as administrative borders over time change, and how to account for that. And I will discuss it later, why it is a problem. So from that sense of definition, we distinguish in migrations internal, which is within one's country of birth and or country of residence, and international, which means over the borders of the country. And then there is in which direction the migration is going on, whether it's out of the borders, because it is always, first we have to presume that the first process to look at is out migration, as we have to look from which population it originates. It's always related to the population from where we come, or into the borders. And again, it is then from different populations that they come from. And from that point of view, we distinguish emigration and immigration in international migration, and out-migration and in-migration in internal migration. But also it can be urban-rural, rural-rural, rural-urban. So we also have to take into account such directions. And why we need to define it more clearly, it is to measure the process and then understand the underlying mechanisms which are driving these processes. So when we study migration processes in a societal development from the long-term perspective, there have been several different approaches to study it. Mostly there have been economic approaches, but it has been very much criticized because of their static and short-run understanding of the process of development. There are spatial approaches which are less related to other social processes, world systems theories and human development theories, which embrace in themselves counteractions between different systems, but criticized by often losing the perspective. And complex system theories, which might be a future challenge for non-linear, non-equilibrial dynamical systems modeling. In this frame, what can demographic theories offer? And I think that demographic theories can offer quite a lot, as all migrants originate from some kind of a population which has its historical memory, and as we say in demography, their collective consciousness, which is driving the generational shifts in their development. Demographic theories also enable to have a macro-level perspective binded with individual behavior patterns which drive the macro-level trends, and offer for migration processes the demographic perspective. That means to relate them to population development from which they originate, and thus better understand how collective and historical memory organizes itself, which are the mechanisms of adaptation and rejection and nonlinear interoperability. Also, it offers a systematic approach into self-organization of new structures and possibly better inclusion into complex system theories. And last but not least, people are carrying all these behavior patterns. So there is no way we can break away from the collective consciousness building, which determine the macro-level trends. When we look at the trends globally in demographic processes, what we see over centennial perspective, that in fertility there is going on globally a convergence. And several continents have or are almost converged already, and the last one, Africa, is about to converge to the other levels. The same applies to mortality trends, as here depicted by trends in life expectancy. And the convergence is very much visible from this perspective as well. Why is that important? Because we know that these countries which have high fertility and high mortality are going to make their transition to a modern kind of demographic behavior, which means low fertility and low mortality. And while they are doing that, population structures go through very profound changes. And what we see here is the depiction of a normal demographic transition in a country from high levels of demographic process to low levels, and underneath the evolving population structures. But why it is important is that exactly these processes develop in one population, in one time, a potential for large emigration and outmigration. And afterwards, it subsides. So, or, as we learn a bit later, also changes in its form. So where is this potential for migration the greatest? What do you think? It's when the natural increase is the largest. So it is in the, here depicted as stage 3. It is at that moment in time when any population in the world have the largest migration potential. And we can confirm it for most of the continents. We saw it from Europe in the end of the 19th century, for Asia in the second half of the 20th century. Latin America is going through now, and Africa is in the beginning of this stage. So that also is where the main part of our migrants are originating from. But I would like you to go maybe further and look more into mobility transition theory, which was originally put forward by Wilbur Zelinsky, a geographer, almost 50 years ago, who was the first to relate spatio-temporal systems to demographic systems, and who actually brought out that there are definite patterned regularities in the growth of personal mobility through space-time, and that these regulations comprise an essential component of the modernization process. So it offers a view on the irreversible progression of stages in the development of migration process. But bear in mind, it's wider, it's mobility process. In what we mean by modernizing, it brings about widening range of options to locate and rule where to go and pattern one's life. Also that these genuine migration patterns mean usually shift not only in spatial but also in social locus, meaning in occupations, religious affiliations, variety of political affiliations, including citizenship, bringing about duality and portability of citizenship nowadays, but also mobility of mind, which means widening access to information, spread of knowledge and educational transition, which we see in Europe nowadays. Already more than 60% of the population are highly educated in the younger generations. So soon there will be a very big transition in that sense for the population structures as well. But it also brings out that there are shallower local attachment and a kind of rootlessness. It might go from organizing increasing community-oriented networks and state formation processes, as we know, which coincide with demographic transitions, to weakening social cohesion and social capital shifts towards more expressive and effective types, as our Vice Rector referred. Everybody now appeals to your feelings. That is what we see. And also the short run and long run view on diversity, or the third demographic transition as put forward by Coleman. So what Zelinsky already warns us is that actually the intrinsic nature of the phenomenon might not have been captured due to definitional problems, and thus there is no available relevant data to actually analyze how these processes evolve. And unfortunately, despite 50 years, he postulated these arguments. This is still true today. How he foresaw mobility transition in its stages, he foresaw that there is, after natural increase is the largest in a population development, that is followed by large emigration, although, of course, at the same time, in-migration is also, out-migration is also relevant at the moment, but it is then more moving towards internal migrations, internal out-migrations, where we see urbanization mostly, and afterwards counter-urbanization processes. And the last phase, he foresees that the migration process will very much differentiate in its nowadays, or there, nowadays, now, our nowadays form, meaning much more commuting. And now the question is, where next? Does this mean now that we become more rooted? And where rooted? Rooted in our place of birth, rather than in our country of residence, with these new evolvements. And of course, with this exchange of information and knowledge, we already see that there is no need to move from the residence. So bear that in mind, that he foresaw it 50 years ago, and it's what we see today. Although today we cannot account for it still. So let's start thinking how we should define actually then these processes or these migrants whom we want to really take our understanding of. First of all, we shouldn't apply colonial thinking, and we are doing it just the same all the time. So if you think of, for instance, those who have born in Fergana, which is a historical Uzbekistan territory, you shouldn't put them into Kyrgyzstan as their birthplace, or as until Soviet Union was there, everybody who fled from Soviet Union to Western countries, they were then put down as originating from Soviet Union. There was no such entity, actually, if you think, as Soviet Union. It was 15 different countries, plus 25 different cultural other units, plus another enormous entity of culturally different units. So thinking of today's problems where we cannot define where our migrants come is actually originating from legal perspectives, which is not a good way to collect your data. So we have to go into the roots and to understand what we need for our future perspectives, especially, by the way, taking into account today's Russia or China. These entities, we cannot collect the data for the whole Russia. It's very different. Another thing is that we need to construct very valid population entities. So we should really apply these characteristics which define these immigrant populations and their diversity in their right way. So we need to have ethnic self-identification, which most of the countries do not collect. We need to have religious affiliation, which most of the countries do not collect, and more going to register-based censuses nowadays. It means that we are not going to have that database at all in near future for multiple of countries, and so on. So we need to understand that in order to really capture the diversity, we need to monitor it. We need to have the data. And for that reason, we also need to think that this rootlessness, what we see, is not actually rootlessness. It's rootedness into other cultural identities. And as we see today, whether in Paris or in other entities, these people are rooted in their own identity for the third generation. And we do not know that they are the third generation of immigrants, actually. So here I have managed to bring some data on different identification of foreign origin in countries. But as you see, it's very diverse. Now, when, for instance, we collect data about whether they are foreign citizens or they are foreign-born, which means they are born in another country than in your host country, then we see that these are very different figures, and often in different countries, very different perspectives you can see. Also, when only some countries we could add for second generation foreign origin population, And we could have for Estonia also these ethnic affiliation, and then you would need, which is around 30, so you would need see that there is around 5 to 6% of the third generation already in Estonia of immigrant population. And Estonia is in the world the only country who has in the last census possibility to distinguish third generation immigrants, which hasn't happened in any other country. And well, we don't have it also next census. What we also need to know is we always have to think where they originate. So we have to go and look at these countries, to look at the population structures, and when we look at the population structures, we see where the potential is. So it's quite normal to be informed. And when you have had a huge immigration in your country, then you would also think that it is a pool for very big return migration. Because the most non-adaptive are the immigrants. And if there is any transition or transformation of a society, they are first to be evoked in their understanding where to go. But if we look in a historical perspective, we see that these, as I told about pool of migration potential, it starts from a pool of emigration out of the borders, usually to related colonial entities, and then a big urbanization process, which afterwards turns into counter-urbanization as we see today. On the example of Estonia, I can give you the example on the differences nowadays on internal and international migration, and you see that internal migration, which is lighter, is much higher than external or international migration, but fortunately in our last census there was a possibility to also understand who are really away from the country. And by that understanding, we could have these figures for educational out-migration and see that actually these measures, what we have in our regular statistics, are much underestimated. We really don't take into account very many movements which are, we go for education for 5 years or for 4 years, and they are not taken into account. This problem of not accounting for real emigration anymore is not only in Estonia. You see here different decades, and it's decreasing over time. It's the same, for instance, for Sweden. So the last decades, it's not taking into account anymore real movements, what usually were in regular migration accounted for anymore. And this has resulted in some artifacts, as for instance also for Estonia or Baltic countries, the big emigration or negative net migration in the beginning of the 90s, which actually was a return migration of the immigrants. And that's why I always tell people that you have to understand whom you are really accounting for. So here is the picture of the figures for out-migration in the 90s for Estonia, for different ethnic self-identification structures. And we see that at that moment, ethnic Estonians were not emigrating their country. They are emigrating now, but not at the moment when there was the societal transformation, which very often is given as the main pool for emigration. And even now, if we take this emigration of Estonians, actually we see that there is very high return migration going on of Estonians from other countries. So actually what we see in our emigration rates is already this commuting phase. And it's not a normal, if you look at these before presented age structures, that is approximately a normal age-specific emigration rate, although the volumes are very low in the last decades. But if you look at the return migration, there's nothing of the kind what you would expect from such emigration patterns. So what I'm telling you is that actually we are not measuring the new forms of movement, and we need to start to measure it. Here is an account as the different generations have set their mind towards rural side, or so-called urban sprawl is going on. So now we should start to think how we, in the era of free movement, how we account for our own European citizens who are traveling, not traveling, they are residing in our countries. We don't account for educational attainment abroad to a large extent. What to do with those who are really commuting, as in Estonia we see it very much, as Finland is very near and actually nearer than the largest city in the south in Estonia. So this commuting, although it's not daily basis commuting, nobody can afford that, but even if it is half a year on one side and half a year in another side, what do we do? As Estonia and Finland are the only countries, I think, in the world who are exchanging their population register data. That means that as social guarantees are offered when they are working in Finland, of course they are registered in Finland as residents, and they are taken off from Estonia as residents. So what are they? Are they actually migrants or not? So one way to go forward is, of course, to start to exchange between different countries, and there are fortunately other possibilities to have population register data on the personal level to exchange, which also needs much more legal attendance in that sense that it needs much better accommodation into data protection directive. But does it solve our problem? Or we need to have much more information what actually is going on. And we need to start thinking how we could really have an understanding of these new phenomena, what are going on. So maybe one way to think is to embrace this mobility transition theory as a whole, as a mobility transition. So think that it is a bit of a wider range thing, and then start to figure out how to measure it. So it means that actually we have to make it cohort-based analysis nowadays on migration, because otherwise we wouldn't know when they returned, when they went away, and whether they have stayed or come back. And only then we maybe can understand how these new phenomena are changing our world. Also link to these individual level behavior patterns, as I already mentioned that nowadays people have dual citizenships. They have even possible to have quadruple citizenships. So what are we talking when we are talking about citizenship? And whether we need then to actually have the rights through citizenship, or there are other entities which might better capture whether the residents in the country, permanent residents in the country, might be the same as the citizenship right. Yep. So thank you for your attention.